I rate myself on the splendid failure to do the impossible, says William Faulkner. Hello, good evening, and welcome to a new episode of Arguably the Reading Quest. I am Nishant. So, in this episode, as it was my long due project, that I wanted to talk about some of the geniuses that were ignored by Nobel Prize, and I believe a few of them were even larger than Nobel Prize itself. So, in this video, I will talk about some of the geniuses that I believe and that, objectively speaking, critics and literateurs and writers and connoisseurs of world literature believed that they should have been awarded a Nobel. And it was quite astonishing on their part and my part as well that how they have been denied the Nobel Prize in Literature. So, what I'll do is that I'll divide, because we know Nobel Prize came into the year 1901. So what I'll do is that I'll divide the timeline into a decade from 1900 to 1910, from 1911 to 1920, from 1921 to 1930, and then I'll name some of the geniuses that I feel, objectively speaking, insofar as I can be objective in this regard, that they should have been awarded a Nobel Prize. And I'll also try to cite one book by them so that you can keep it for your further reference and use it for your studies, for your reading, if you feel like. So it started in the year 1901. So in the first decade, that is 1900 to 1910, the name of a writer that immediately comes to my mind. So the first suggestion for the first decade would be none other than Leo Tolstoy. You'll be surprised that Tolstoy died in the year 1910. But what is even surprising was that how a writer of the stature of Tolstoy could have been overlooked, could have been ignored by the Nobel Prize. I have not done any research whether Tolstoy was nominated, whether he was shortlisted or not. Please do tell me if you come across any such research that whether he was nominated or shortlisted. But he was definitely not awarded a Nobel Prize. A writer of the stature of Tolstoy. So if one book of Tolstoy that I'll suggest, apart from his short stories, is The Death of Ivan Ilyich, on which I have also done a video. The Death of Ivan Ilyich is an existential classic, although Tolstoy was a sociologist, whereas Dostoevsky was an existentialist, a psychologist. But The Death of Ivan Ilyich comes as close to describing a harrowing and a slow death of a seemingly healthy man as closely and as poignantly as possible. And that stands as a milestone in existential classic written by a so-called sociologist. So Leo Tolstoy definitely remains my first preference. What is even astonishing is that Thomas Hardy, who lived till the year 1928, who died in the year 1928. So 28 years since the Nobel Prize was instituted, and he died in the year 1928, and he was overlooked. I don't know whether he was nominated or not, but he was definitely not awarded the Nobel Prize. Now, who was more influential than Hardy when it comes to Victorian literature? So much so that the connoisseurs and the literateurs always have a debate on whether should it be the age of Dickens or should we call it the age of Hardy? Should it be the age of Dickens versus Hardy? Has been a perennial debate, and the debate has still not came to a conclusion. So Thomas Hardy is my second preference. If you want to read just one book by Thomas Hardy, my suggestion will be Far from the Madding Crowd. If you just want to read one chapter by Thomas Hardy, it will be the chapter 2 of Far from the Madding Crowd, titled The Night. So you will get a glimpse of what an iconic writer he was. He was an heir to George Eliot, and he was a champion of depicting the rural life of Victorian England, a master of the prose, and the lesser said the better. Thomas Hardy has no parallels, but astonishingly he was denied the Nobel Prize. To my utter surprise, I very recently stumbled upon this fact that he lived till 1928, because I was under the impression, somehow I had forgotten, I overlooked that, he died before Nobel Prize was instituted. What a blasphemy, I'll say. Now, from the second decade, that is from 1910 to 1920, the first name that comes to my mind, of course, retrospectively, because usually we award a writer who has crossed 60 years or at least 50 years of age. So, Franz Kafka, that comes to my mind, because Franz Kafka died so young. He passed away in the year 1924. So, Franz Kafka is one name that should have been awarded posthumously, of course, posthumously, if there would have been a provision to award Nobel Prize posthumously. So Franz Kafka, and he was a master of existentialism, absurdism, and Kafka was one that challenged the Western rationality and the maddening bureaucracy wedded with totalitarianism. So one classic of Kafka that I'll suggest is The Metamorphosis. Apart from Metamorphosis, the second name that immediately comes to my mind is The Trial. So Franz Kafka was a genius. Another name that comes to my mind is from France in the same decade, 1910 to 1920. That is Marcel Proust. He passed away in the year 1922. Marcel Proust was famous for his 7-volume long novel titled In Search of Lost Time, sometimes also translated as A Remembrance of the Things Past. So the first volume of In Search of Lost Time is definitely recommended. Please keep it in your reference. Marcel Proust. Now coming to the third decade, that is from 1920 to 1930. One name that is my very personal favorite, and he was a controversial name. He was not very easily published. He was considered as, to an extent, a soft pornographer. Had it not been for the effort of E.M. Forster, he would have been almost forgotten. And yes, if you've guessed it right. He was none other than D.H. Lawrence. D.H. Lawrence passed away in the year 1930. And D.H. Lawrence was a poet and someone who vehemently and vociferously discarded T.S. Eliot's idea of the theory of impersonality, because every line minded D.H. Lawrence wrote was shown overwhelming presence of his. So that was a clear-cut refutation as a challenge to the theory of impersonality by T.S. Eliot. One book by D.H. Lawrence that I'll suggest is, of course, Rainbow, his very first book, his very first popular success. His very first book novel was The White Peacock. That's a different issue altogether. But The Rainbow is my first suggestion. The second suggestion will be Lady Chatterley's Lover, for which he was very infamously known. And because Nobel Prize, is largely instituted or conferred upon those writers who were largely known to the English-speaking world through translation, and because there has been a lot of sociological, politics of translation around the world, and India suffered a lot. So when it comes to realism, 3 names that immediately come to our mind to an informed reader is Balzac from France, Charles Dickens from England, and Prem Chand from India. So what a parochial attitude that they have. I don't know whether they have even known that a man called Prem Chand existed, but Prem Chand is my second nomination from the third decade. Prem Chand passed away in the year 1936. The age of Hindi literature and the our age of Hindu literature, I believe, the our language, the Hindi we know, started from Prem Chand. It didn't start with Bharatendu Harishchandra. And it is my subjective opinion and I stand with it. It started with Prem Chand. And Prem Chand was his pseudonym. The real name was Dhanpat Rai. So if one book by Prem Chand that I'll suggest is Godan, please read it. Another name, and the writings of his were quite disturbing, filled with melancholy, sadness, wistfulness, and it will force you into a pensive isolation if you have the sagacity to delve deeper into the writing. Immediately, the third name that comes to my mind is Fernando Pessoa. He passed away in the year 1935, the third nomination for the third decade. And just one book that I'll recommend by Fernando Pessoa is the Book of Disquiet. So every page, Book of Disquiet is the finest poetical autobiography or a diary of iconic literature that you will ever encounter. So every page is an exercise in the poetics of suffering, if I can use a word. The poetics of suffering. So you will enjoy reading Fernando Pessoa. Now the fourth decade, that is 1930 to 1940. While all these the names were geniuses, but I'd apply one adjective, one name that appears to my mind in this decade that clearly demarcated the birth of modernist literature, their age and our age. That is one paradigmatic genius, and he was an institution in himself, perhaps a man who was greater than Nobel Prize itself, and none other than James Joyce. So James Joyce is one writer from Ireland that is my personal favorite. While he is mostly revered, mostly intimidated and feared for, and of course respected for his writing Ulysses and Finnegan Wakes, but he will be most loved for his writing A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. A classic that clearly demarcates the birth of nonconformist, soft-spoken rebels, bohemians, iconoclast, modernist heroes, and the very concept of the angry young man. This is our age of literature and the birth of angry young man, the birth of artist as an angry young man. So without reading James Joyce, you cannot get a feel of our age of literature. So one book that I'll recommend is of course A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Slightly difficult read, slightly higher on symbolism. I have done a detailed video on that. You can go to my video section and please check it. So James Joyce was one writer that tried to resolve the problem of spirit in the laboratory of language. How far he has succeeded is yet to be debated and discussed. The second name that comes to my mind immediately is Robert Musil. He passed away in the year 1942. Robert Musil should have been awarded the Nobel Prize. If one book that I recommend by Musil, apart from his most well-known, that is A Man with No Qualities, that is titled A Man Without a Quality, in 3 volumes. But the book that I'll recommend to be read for the beginners, and I've also included this name in this title that I'm going to recommend in the four-part philosophical novels of all time that I have done, is The Confusions of Young Thoreau, definitely to be read. So Robert Musil was one such modernist genius, of course, and coming from Germany, so no one can doubt German writers of those period. From the 5th decade, that is 1940 to 1950, a name that comes to my mind, and a contemporary of a little junior than Rabindranath Tagore, and again from Bengal, writing in Bengali and having a command on close to 10 foreign languages, including Greek, Latin, English, Hindi and Bengali, is none other than Aurobindo Ghosh. He passed away in the year 1950. So Aurobindo Ghosh, Savitri was an attempt of a classic retelling of the modern day epic. So he wrote Savitri since the beginning of time and since the end of time in some thousands and thousands of couplets in English language. That was the genius of Aurobindo. And what a miss by Nobel Prize committee, that we will be surprised to know that Aurobindo Ghosh wrote Savitri in 23,837 lines. So close to 12,000 couplets in English were there. So can you imagine the genius of the man? So most of the critique, I'm not sure why he has not been awarded a Nobel Prize in Literature. And then he was a spiritualist par excellence. He was someone who also commented vehemently and vociferously on the Vedantic and the Upanishadic text. And he was a philosopher, Indian philosopher in his own rights. And of course, many shorter poems. He is known for that standard of poetry that can match to the classicism of the antiquity of Greek and Latin, and he has no parallels. But why he has been denied is something to be discussed upon. Maybe I believe the Nobel Prize Committee, and I dare say, lack the sagacity to interpret a poem as deep and as profound as Savitri. So if one book that you can read, of course, I mean, it is as incomprehensible as James Joyce's Ulysses, but you may buy the book and like dabble with one page or the other to see how English is written, how it is framed, how couplets are formed, what are the English collocations in use, what are the new phrases and expressions, freshness of expressions, and all such things, to be, just to delve into it as a butterfly that flutters from one flower to another. Another name that comes to my mind, and I've discussed it and I've made a video on that, and he lost to Albert Camus by one vote, was one of the finest Greek poet, author, translator, philosopher and novelist from Greek, and the most widely translated Greek writers, Nikos Kazantzakis. He passed away in the year 1957. I believe he should have been awarded a Nobel. I have done a video on him, on his novel, The Last Temptation of Christ. An iconic novel and a very different retelling of the story of Christ, human Christ. So if one book that I'll suggest by Nikos Kazantzakis is, of course, The Last Temptation of Christ. Another name that comes to my mind from this very same decade, from 1940 to 50, is by Bertolt Brecht. Brecht was a communist, was a staunch communist, a poet, a dramatist, and a revolutionary. He passed away in the year 1956. He should have been awarded a Nobel Prize. If one book of Brecht, I believe one must dabble with his poetry first and then with his... So there are many famous poems by him that you can, dabble with and then further proceed to his drama. Bertolt Brecht is definitely the suggestion. Now in the next decade, that is sixth decade, from 1950 to 1960, we have one name that was nominated a record 9 times but never to be awarded. And he is known for his classic dystopian novel that was even far more penetrating than the novel written by George Orwell, 1984. And his version of dystopia was far more frightening, far more realistic and penetrating than Orwell's version of dystopia. I have done a video on this too. And he is none other than Aldous Huxley. He passed away in the year 1963. He was a futurist. He studied Eastern mysticism and Eastern philosophy, and then he dissected Western civilization as well, and what's wrong with this whole Western civilization in particular and our modern civilization in general. So if one book that I'll recommend is, of course, Brave New World Visited, but apart from that, you should also read a collection of essays by him, that is Brave New World Revisited, to explain the themes that he broached and discussed in Brave New World Visited. So 2 series, Brave New World Visited and Brave New World Revisited. And then another book that is not a dystopian novel, that is an utopian novel by him, wherein what would a world be if best of the Eastern mystical philosophy, Eastern religion is combined in tandem with the Western philosophy and Western science to produce a human heaven. That novel is titled Island. So please read Island, strongly recommended. Apart from that, another name that definitely comes to my mind is Ezra Pound. He passed away in the year 1972. But I'm keeping him in the sixth decade itself, in the year 1950 1960, for the sheer reason that he was already very popular by that time. So he should have been awarded. He was so popular that you can imagine that it was he who insisted T.S. Eliot to publish his poem The Wasteland. And The Wasteland, the final draft of Wasteland that was published, was edited by Ezra Pound. And Ezra Pound was influential in publishing this. He actually persuaded T.S. Eliot to publish this poem, so much so that in the final draft, T.S. Eliot dedicated his book to Ezra Pound, and he wrote, "To a greater genius." So you can understand the genius of Ezra Pound. So he was a classicist in the same term as T.S. Eliot was. And he stick to the austerity of the classic age. So you can dabble with his poems, but very difficult. Another name, and a very, very personal favorite, again I have done a video on that, and I have chosen one of his novels in order to be kept in my series of philosophical novels that I have done. And the name is none other than Somerset Maugham. He passed away in the year 1965. Somerset Maugham was the highest paying writer of his time. He was one writer that charged a whooping sum that all of these writers that I have mentioned couldn't even think of. So he was a celebrity. He was a celebrity in his own right. And if I have to coin a term, felicity for language. So the felicity, the cheerfulness for language, the effortless ease and the discerning insight with which he wrote was unparalleled. So Somerset Maugham, one book that I'll suggest, and if you really want to know what a pleasure reading English language could be, it will be Somerset Maugham's Of Human Bondage. Please read it. Highly, highly recommend it. Now coming to the seventh decade, that is from 1960 to 1970, a name that immediately comes to my mind is W.H. Auden. W.H. Auden passed away in the year 1973. He was an American poet. Very poignant. So much of pathos and so much of suffering was there in his writing. How Nobel Prize missed him is another matter of investigation and the matter of speculation. But Auden is definitely one of my personal favorites is Auden, including Lawrence and Joyce. So W.H. Auden is to be read in tandem and parallelly with D.H. Lawrence, James Joyce, Fernando Pessoa, so that you can compare and contrast and you can draw many striking parallels in their writing. So W.H. Auden, who was a modernist, yet he couldn't succumb to the parameters of modernism. He has his own parameters. So you can dabble with some of the poems of W.H. Auden as well. Another name, an iconic genius again, and known for his autobiographical fiction, that is Goodbye to All That, was Robert Graves. He passed away in the year 1985, but I am keeping him in the seventh decade, that is from 1960 to 1970, for the sheer reason that he was already very famous by that time. And he won almost all the popular awards that can be imagined, all the reputed covetous award that can be imagined. He was nominated for a Nobel Prize, but to your utter surprise, let me tell you, one of the committee members objected that they cannot award the prize to any Anglo-Saxon poet before Ezra Pound, because that committee member, I forgot his name, because that, and it's a very documented thing, you can Google, you can see it in Wikipedia, that committee member objected that because Ezra Pound has not been awarded and he don't think that Robert Graves comes anywhere close to the quality and to the genius of Ezra Pound, and that is why Robert Graves will not be awarded the prize. And he is known for his iconic I, Claudius, and then Claudius the God, these kind of series in drama, and then a scholarly poetic study of the White Goddess, the myth of White Goddess, and a definitive compilation of the Greek myth. So an amazing writer who adhered to all the standards of the classical age, at par with Ezra Pound. no less than that. And I believe that reputation is guaranteed. So if one book that you can definitely have is The Definitive Greek Myth by Robert Graves. I have it here, right here. The Greek Myth. Now come to the eighth decade, that is from 1970 to 1980. So one name that immediately comes to my mind is Jorge Luis Borges. Borges passed away in the year 1986, and he was a master of, is the father of magic realism and one of the most popular writer, Latin American writer after Miguel de Cervantes, Spanish writer after Miguel de Cervantes, is Jorge Luis Borges. So if one book that you can read by Jorge Luis Borges is The Garden of Bifurcated Paths and his collected fiction. One name from Indian Peninsula that comes to my mind is and a very profound poet, known for his diversity of writing as much as for his voluminous writing and powerfully evoking memories of revolution, is none other than Faiz Ahmad Faiz. He passed away in the year 1984. Whether Faiz was nominated or not, I do not know. And I think he was not. But if a poet of the stature of Faiz cannot be nominated, I mean, we have all the rights to blame Nobel Prize of Eurocentrism, which indeed it was. Because if you see, Nobel Prize is centered around Europe and America largely. And the rest of the world is barren, bereft of Nobel Prize. So Faiz Ahmad Faiz. You can read his, collected poems published at Raj Kamal Prakashan. Famously known for his poetry, मुझसे पहली सी मोहब्बत मेरे महबूब न मांग, मैंने समझा था कि तू है तो दरख्शां है हयात, तेरा गम है तो गमे दहर का झगड़ा क्या है, तेरी सूरत से है आलम में बहारों को सबात, तेरी आँखों के सिवा दुनिया में रखा क्या है, तू जो मिल जाए तो तकदीर निगूं हो जाए, यूं न था मैंने फ़कत चाहा था यूं हो जाए. So more than reading, you can listen Faiz. He has been sung by a plethora of ghazal gayaks, starting from Noor Jahan to Jagjit Singh. The third name that comes to my mind was a live-in partner of Jean-Paul Sartre, and she is none other than Simone de Beauvoir. She passed away in the year 1986, and she was one of those writers who can be associated with the first wave of European feminism. The first wave. Well, you can say the first wave or not, because the first wave started with Mary Wollstonecraft, but that's a matter of that's besides the point. But the first known prominent wave of feminism was given the impetus and the stimulus by Simone de Beauvoir in his writing Second Sex, where he says that a woman is not born, she is made. So if one book I will suggest, that is of course The Second Sex, you can read. Now coming to the ninth decade, that is from 1980 to 1999, is R.K. Narayanan. R.K. Narayanan passed away in the year 2001. I have put it in the ninth decade, that is 1980 to 1990, because he was already very famous by the 60s. And in the year 1965, a film guide has been made on his novel, The Guide itself, directed by Devanand's brother, starring Devanand, Waida Rahman, and the music was given by S.D. Burman. R.K. Narayanan should have been included because he was the founder of English writing in India, and he was one of the founders of, apart from Raja Rao and Mulk Rajanand, he was a founder of English novels in India, famously known for Guide and a series of episodes, a series of writing called the Malgudi Days, which was later converted into episodes. So, if one book that I'll recommend is definitely The Guide by R.K. Narayanan. I'd soon make a video on The Guide as well. Now coming to the final decade of the last millennium, that is 1990 to 2000. One name that comes to my mind is Iris Murdoch. Iris Murdoch passed away in the year 1999. She was a philosopher of ethics. She was a prolific writer, producing volumes of novels. But if one book that I'll recommend is her compilation of writings, including a long uh, interview on Platonic studies, and the book is titled Existentialists and Mystiques, is a must-read one by Iris Murdoch. Now coming to the first decade of the new millennium, first decade of 21st century, that is from the year 2000 to 2010. One name, he passed away in the year 2016. It has been said that, he was one of the most well-read writers of, the past 2 centuries, that is the 20th century and the 21st century, from Italy. I hope you have guessed the name. Very famous for his collection of 30,000 books in his own personal library. He termed it the anti-library. And that is none other than Umberto Eco. Umberto Eco is such a big miss from 21st century, as big as James Joyce from the last century. If one book by Umberto Eco that I'll suggest is The Name of the Rose. And then the second book is The Confession of Young Novelist by Umberto Eco. Another book, writer that could have been nominated and a perennial contender for Nobel Prize. I'll say perennial contender for Nobel Prize since the year 1990 and afterwards, but strongly so after 2000, was none other than Milan Kundera. Milan Kundera passed away in the year 2023. Why he hadn't got the prize is another matter of speculation, maybe because Nobel Prize committee didn't like his take on his own female characters that were either playing a second fiddle to the larger male existentialist characters, or his crude treatment of female sexuality. Is something to be speculated and debated and discussed. But he was, one of the icons, the heroes that commanded a kind of charisma that is unfounded in these 40-50 years, trust me. So much so that I can quote most of his quotes verbatim. One of the favorite books of mine is not The Unbearable Lightness of Being, pardon me, it is The Immortality. So if one book that you should read is Immortality first, but let me quote him from his Unbearable Lightness of Being. So the quote goes, he suddenly recalls from Plato's Symposium that people were hermaphrodites until God split them into two. And since then, one half keeps searching and wandering for the second half of themselves that they have lost. Love is the longing for the half of the ourselves that we have lost, says Milan Kundera. Iconic writer, powerful quotes. It will haunt you and it will remain with you forever. Perhaps the last existentialist of that generation, I'll say. Then the second decade of this millennium, that is 2010 to 2020, a name that immediately comes to my mind. And she became popular in the year 1963 itself, none other than A.S. Bayat, popularly known for her novel A Possession that won her International Booker. So if one novel that I'll suggest is A.S. Bayat. So that is all for today, guys. I have suggested 25 novelists. I have also given in bits and pieces based on my subjective opinion as to why they should have been awarded a Nobel Prize. I hope you have enjoyed, watching the video. I know I have missed many names of equal stature for one reason or the other. What are the names that you think should have been included that I couldn't do and they should have been awarded Nobel Prize posthumously? Please write in the comment section. I have also, created a Instagram profile where I'll also posting related to the similar stuffs. So you can find the Instagram profile by the same name, arguably The Reading Quest. So please do visit my Instagram profile as well. Keep watching, keep spreading the word. If you have still not liked, shared and subscribed my YouTube channel, arguably The Reading Quest, please do that. Happy reading, guys. Thank you so much.